When 29-year-old Carmen Morales has showed up at the gates of millionaire Alejandro Ruiz's mansion, holding a 4-year-old girl in her arms, she had no idea that her desperate plea would forever change two lives. Her clothes were torn, her hair disheveled, and her eyes filled with tears. With a trembling voice, Carmen uttered the words that sent a chill through Alejandro. Please, sir, can I clean your house in exchange for a plate of food for my daughter? But when Alejandro looked closely at the little girl's face, his world collapsed. Those eyes, that smile, the shape of her face. It was impossibly identical to his own. The child was the spitting image of his daughter Emma, who had died 5 years earlier in a tragic accident. Or maybe Emma had never really died. The Ruiz mansion stood majestically on the hills of the Sierra de Madrid, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that caught the golden light of the Castilian sunset. Alejandro Ruiz, 45, one of Spain's wealthiest businessmen with a fortune of 500 million euros, was sitting in his study when the doorbell echoed through the empty house. It was a November afternoon. The cold mountain wind carried the scent of pine and crisp air. Alejandro wasn't expecting anyone. For the past 5 years, he had lived in near isolation after his wife Francisca and daughter Emma were killed in a car crash that shattered his life. The only people he saw were his housekeeper, who came 3 times a week, and his lawyers for business matters. The second ring annoyed him. He rose from the leather armchair where he'd been reading business documents and walked to the front door. Through the video intercom, he saw a shadowy female figure holding something in her arms, probably another salesperson or someone asking for donations. But when he opened the door, he was left speechless. Standing before him was a young woman, about 29, with long, wind-tossed brown hair and green eyes full of desperation. She wore torn jeans, a faded red hoodie, and worn-out sneakers. In her arms was a 4-year-old girl with curly blonde hair, her little face asleep against her mother's shoulder. The woman was shaking, not just from the cold, but from fear and the humiliation of what she was about to ask. When she looked up at Alejandro, tears began streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. In a broken whisper, she begged to clean his house in exchange for food for her daughter. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. Something stirred in Alejandro's chest, an emotion he'd buried years ago. But as he looked at the pleading woman, the little girl slowly woke up. She lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and gazed at Alejandro with sleepy blue eyes. Time stopped. Alejandro stared at the child's face, and the blood froze in his veins. Those blue eyes were identical to his own. The shape of her face, the tiny mole on her right cheek, even the way she tilted her head when confused. It was like looking into a mirror of the past, like seeing his daughter Emma at 4 years old again. The resemblance was so uncanny, so exact that he had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. His heart pounded so hard he thought the whole street might hear it. In a shaky voice, he asked the girl's name. The answer chilled him to the bone. Emma. The child was named Emma, just like his daughter who had died. Alejandro felt his world crumble. It wasn't possible. His Emma had died 5 years ago. He'd seen her body in the hospital. He'd arranged the funeral. He'd wept at her grave for months. Yet, without another word, he ushered them inside. As Carmen carried Emma into the mansion, Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off the girl. Every movement, every expression, every little gesture was exactly as he remembered his daughter's. It was as if the ghost of his past had come to life. But how? And who was this woman claiming to be Emma's mother? He led them to the grand living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the fireplace. The little girl stared wide-eyed at the vast space and elegant furniture, while Carmen still seemed stunned to have been invited in. While Alejandro prepared food in the kitchen, he kept stealing glances at Emma. She sat beside her mother, playing with a worn rag doll, likely her only toy. Every motion only confirmed the astonishing likeness. He returned with a tray loaded with food. Carmen thanked him through tears as Emma ate hungrily, like a child who hadn't seen a meal in days. Alejandro asked them to tell him their story. Carmen explained that she'd been widowed 2 years earlier when her husband Marcos died in a workplace accident. Since then, she'd struggled to get by with odd jobs while raising Emma alone. 3 months ago, she lost her factory job and could no longer pay rent. They'd been sleeping in the car or makeshift shelters ever since, but Alejandro's attention was fixed on Emma. She had finished eating and was now studying the paintings on the walls. When she spotted a family photo of Alejandro, Francisca, and their original Emma, she stood and walked over. In her sweet little voice, she said the girl in the picture looked just like her. Carmen glanced at the photo and went pale. Alejandro explained that it was his daughter Emma, who had died 5 years ago along with his wife in a car crash. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then Emma did something that made Alejandro tremble. She called him a daddy in the exact same sweet tone his daughter had used. It was impossible. Carmen quickly took Emma's hand, apologizing and saying the child was confused. Alejandro stood abruptly and headed to his study. He needed to check something that might explain the impossible. He opened the safe and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in years, all the documents from the accident 5 years earlier. He reread everything carefully, looking for anything he might have missed. Then he found it, a strange note in the hospital report, handwritten in the margin. Identification problematic due to body condition, additional DNA verification required. He'd never seen that note before. Digging deeper, he found another shocking document, a request for a DNA test that he himself had signed. But attached was a form stating the test had been canceled at the family's request. He had never canceled it. He returned to the living room with trembling hands. Emma had fallen asleep on the sofa, curled up like a little angel, while Carmen gently covered her with a blanket. Alejandra asked Carmen a crucial question. Did she know anything about Emma's origins? Was Emma truly her biological daughter? Carmen, offended, insisted of course she was. She had given birth to her at El Escorial Hospital in 2019. Alejandro sat beside her and said he believed there was something they both needed to uncover, something that had been hidden for 5 years. The next morning, Alejandro woke early after a sleepless night. He had put Carmen and Emma in the guest room, but he hadn't been able to close his eyes. He went downstairs and made breakfast, a gesture he hadn't done in years. When Emma came in, she ran straight to him, smiling and thanking him for letting them stay. Alejandro knelt to her level and asked if she remembered anything from when she was very little, before living with her mom. She thought for a moment but shook her head. She only remembered her mom and Daddy Marcos. Alejandro told Carmen they needed to go to El Escorial Hospital. He suspected an error, or something worse, had happened 5 years ago. He believed the child he had buried wasn't Emma, and that this Emma was his daughter, the one he thought was dead. An hour later, they arrived at the hospital. Alejandro had called ahead and arranged a meeting with Dr. Benitez, head of pediatrics, who had been on duty the night of the accident. Dr. Benitez greeted them in his office, looking concerned. When Alejandro asked him to look closely at Emma, the doctor studied her and turned as white as a sheet, whispering that it wasn't possible. With shaking hands, he pulled a medical file from the cabinet and opened it on his desk. What it revealed shocked everyone. That night, 2 cars had been involved in the crash. One carrying Alejandro's wife and daughter, the other a couple and their child. The couple died instantly, but their little girl survived. Carmen's biological parents had died in the accident, but she hadn't been with them that night. She'd stayed with her grandparents. Emma had been in Alejandro's wife's car, but a tragic mistake had been made during identification. The bodies were in such bad condition that the girls' identities were switched. The child Alejandro buried was the other family's daughter. His Emma had survived and been sent to an orphanage as the orphan child of the other family. Soon after, Carmen and Marcos applied to adopt, and through a series of bureaucratic coincidences, they were given Emma with a new identity. No one knew about the initial mix-up. Alejandro looked at Emma, who gazed back at him with innocent blue eyes. His daughter was alive. She had always been alive, growing up just miles away without him knowing. But Dr. Benitez said there was more Alejandro needed to know. He closed his office door and sat back down, looking like a man about to reveal a terrible secret. He explained that shortly after the accident, an elegant man identifying himself as a lawyer from Alejandro's insurance company had visited him. The man had convincing documents and new private family details. He said he wanted to spare Alejandro the trauma of seeing his daughter in that condition. The young, inexperienced doctor believed him. The man also offered a substantial donation to the hospital. Later, the same man returned with more papers, saying the surviving girl from the other crash needed to be placed quickly with a family, and he'd already found the perfect couple. Carmen and Marcos, Alejandro suddenly understood the full extent of the manipulation. Someone had orchestrated everything to keep Emma away from him. When the doctor described the tall man in his 50s with gray hair and a scar on his left hand, Alejandro recognized him instantly. Victor Mendoza, his former business partner, the man he had fired and reported for embezzlement just before the accident. The pieces fell into place. Mendoza had always resented Alejandro's success and vowed revenge when he was exposed. Dr. Benitez revealed more disturbing details. After Emma was placed with Carmen's family, Mendoza kept visiting the hospital. Once the doctor overheard him on the phone saying Alejandro must never know the girl was alive, that his suffering was the price. Alejandro clenched his fists. Mendoza hadn't just stolen millions from him, he had stolen 5 years with his daughter. 5 years of love, growth, and irreplaceable moments. Carmen, who had listened in silence, spoke up. Alejandro needed to think of Emma first. The girl needed stability, not revenge. Alejandro looked at Emma, who was watching without fully understanding. She smiled at him and called him a daddy again, spontaneously. His heart broke and healed at the same time. His daughter had called him daddy again, and this time he knew it was true. He told her gently that she hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, she had done something wonderful. She had come back to her daddy. But as he hugged her, Alejandro knew the battle was just beginning. He had to confront Mendoza. But first, he needed to figure out how to handle things with Carmen, who had raised Emma as her own for 4 years. The drive home was heavy with tension and silence. Emma slept in the back seat, unaware of the emotional earthquake shaking the adults around her. When they arrived, Alejandro carried Emma to the guest room and tucked her in, kissing her forehead softly. For the first time in 5 years, he was saying goodnight to his daughter. The emotion was so overwhelming, he had to leave the room to keep from breaking down. In the living room, Carmen sat on the sofa, hands shaking as she held a cup of tea. Alejandro sat across from her, both knowing the difficult conversation ahead. Carmen said Emma was her whole life. She had raised her since she was 6 months old, the only family she had left after Marcos died. Alejandro said he understood her pain, but Emma was his daughter too. He had lost 5 years with her, 5 years mourning her death and visiting an empty grave. Carmen replied that she had spent 4 years loving Emma as her own, caring for her when she was sick, comforting her when she was scared, teaching her to walk and talk. Alejandro stood by the window, staring into the dark garden. They faced an impossible dilemma: how to resolve this without destroying Emma. But both loved the same child, both with legitimate claims that seemed incompatible. Then Alejandro had an idea. He asked Carmen if they really had to choose. Emma needed both of them, him as her biological father and her as the only mother she had ever known. He proposed they become a family, all 3 of them together. Not marriage, but living as a family and raising Emma together. Carmen had no home or job, and there was plenty of room in the mansion. Carmen initially protested that she couldn't accept charity, but Alejandro explained it wasn't charity. It was necessity. Emma needed stability, and the only real stability was having both of them in her life. Carmen thought for a long time, then asked what would happen with Mendoza. They couldn't let what he did go unpunished. Alejandro tensed at the name, but she was right. If they didn't stop him, he might try to separate them again or ruin other lives. They decided to confront Mendoza together, with Emma safe but present to show him what his cruel games had caused. The next day, Alejandro learned Mendoza lived in a mansion outside Madrid, bought with the money he'd stolen. That night, while Emma slept, Alejandro and Carmen prepared for the confrontation that would finally close the circle of Mendoza's revenge. Mendoza's mansion was softly lit when they arrived the following evening. They had left Emma with Alejandro's housekeeper after gently explaining they had important business to settle for their future together. When Mendoza opened the door, his polite smile turned to pure terror at the sight of Alejandro. He stammered in surprise as Alejandro told him coldly that they needed to talk about his daughter, Emma. Mendoza let them into his lavishly furnished living room, furniture likely bought with Alejandro's stolen money. When Alejandro said Emma was alive and he had found her, Mendoza's face showed total panic. He collapsed into an armchair, head in his hands. Under pressure, Mendoza confessed everything. After being fired and reported, he had lost his wife, children, and reputation. He wanted Alejandro to feel the same pain. He had orchestrated the identity switch, the fake documents, and Emma's placement with Carmen and Marcos says. Carmen shouted that Emma was just an innocent child. How could he use her for revenge? Mendoza said he thought she'd be better off growing up away from Alejandro, that he hadn't meant to harm her, only to make Alejandro suffer. Alejandro stepped closer, rage boiling inside. He told Mendoza he had stolen 5 years of his life with his daughter, 5 years spent crying over an empty grave while she grew up believing she was an orphan. Mendoza admitted he regretted it every day. When he saw how broken Alejandro was, he realized he'd gone too far, but it was too late to undo it. Alejandro pulled out his phone and revealed he had recorded the entire conversation. Mendoza had just confessed to kidnapping, document forgery, and corruption. He would spend the rest of his life in prison,